Welcome to Shad's Guitar Show. Whether it's the gear or the players who made the gear famous, join me each episode as we discuss all things guitar. Well, hey there, and welcome into another exciting episode of Shad's Guitar Show. I am so glad to have you joining me, as always, as we talk all things guitar. And I hope you guys have been enjoying the new format, which is kind of on Mondays. I release a longer, kind of more in-depth sort of episode. And then on Thursdays, I've been doing the mini episodes, which are just a few minutes long, which I think has been kind of cool. I've enjoyed that, and hopefully you guys have too. I'm trying to pick topics for the mini episodes that don't require like a really long sort of episode, just some topics we can talk about, but I think it keeps it interesting, and I've been having a lot of fun doing that, and hopefully you guys are enjoying that as well. So today we're going to jump into guitar amplifiers, and in particular one brand, and that is Dumble Amplifiers. They are the stuff of legend, as we all know, but you may not know much about Dumble Amplifiers or the man behind them, Alexander Dumble. So we're going to kind of just talk about the story of Dumble Amplifiers, what makes them so great, why they're so coveted, and just learn a little about these. So let's dive into a history lesson on Dumble Amplifiers. There is no amplifier in the history of the electric guitar that has generated more mythology and more obsession than an amp built by a reclusive Californian named Alexander Dumble. In fact, I would say that second only maybe to the burst era Les Pauls is the obsession and the lore around these particular amplifiers in the guitar and gear world. He never advertised, he never went to NAMM, he built maybe 300 amps in his entire life, mostly one at a time, and mostly for players he handpicked himself. And today, if you find one for sale, it'll easily be going for six figures. So who was this guy? Why did some of the greatest guitarists alive, guys like Stevie Ray Vaughan, Carlos Santana, Robin Ford, John Mayer, build entire rigs, entire careers around boxes built by one man in a garage? Well, that's the show today. I'm Shad, and of course, this is Shad's Guitar Show, and we're going deep into the Dumble mystique. Our story starts in Bakersfield, California in 1944. That's the birthplace of Howard Alexander Dumble. And yes, Bakersfield, same town that gave us Buck Owens and the whole Bakersfield sound. Different corner of the guitar world entirely, but it's a fun bit of trivia for us since we've spent plenty of time on this show talking about Telecasters and twang from that exact same patch of dirt. Dumble was an electronics kid before he was a guitar kid. By some accounts, he was building and selling little pocket radios around age 12. In high school, he played football, and he got interested in electronics for real after he was asked to fix his school's PA system. He just had that kind of brain. Give him a soldering iron and a problem, and he'd figure it out. By his late teens, that hobby had already turned into paying work. He was repairing and modifying amplifiers for working guitarists around California, and he started out the way most great amp builders start out, not inventing from scratch, but modifying what already existed. In his case, that meant Fender Tweed amps and Blackface amps. He'd get inside a deluxe or a Bassman, rework the circuit, and hand it back transformed. Here's the detail that a lot of people don't know. Before Dumble was Dumble, he built amps for Mosrite. That's Simi Mosley's company, famous for the guitars the Ventures played. Dumble was around 20 years old, a fellow Bakersfield native, and Mosley brought him in to build amplifiers for the Ventures camp. As the story goes, the Ventures themselves weren't crazy about his amps. Apparently, they felt they were a little too rock and roll for their kind of clean, twangy instrumental sound. But the experience sharpened his skills and got him thinking bigger. And by the mid to late 1960s, he was building amps under his own name. In 1969, he built what's considered his first true original design, a modified Fender-style circuit he called the Explosion. That amp would later be reworked and revoiced into the design that made him famous, but we'll get into that in a minute. Now, here's where Dumble stops being just another amp tech and starts becoming a legend. Because at some point, he made a decision that basically no other amp builder in history had made. He refused to scale up. Think about Leo Fender. Think about Jim Marshall. Both of those guys started as tinkerers too, but both of them eventually built factories, hired staff, published spec sheets, and shipped thousands of identical amplifiers a year. That's how you become a brand. Dumble looked at this model and said, "Not for me." He never published specifications. He never really advertised. He didn't run consistent, repeatable production models the way that a normal company would. Every single amplifier that left his shop was hand-built, one at a time, and very often it was tailored to a specific player who ordered it. Their touch, their guitar, the venues they played, and even the effects they liked to run in front of it. And getting one built for you wasn't like walking into a store. There was an actual audition process. To even get in the room with Dumble, you typically needed a recommendation from somebody already inside his inner circle. Then maybe you'd play for him in person, casually, or he'd ask you to send a recording. And fame didn't buy you a shortcut. There are stories of him turning down big-name players who wanted in. He wasn't chasing celebrity endorsements. He wanted to build for musicians he personally believed were exceptional. That's a wild business model if you think about it. He wasn't trying to maximize output or revenue. He was trying to build, quite literally, the best sounding amplifier he could make for one specific human being, hands, and ears. Every amp got smarter as he went too. He'd tweak circuits between builds, sometimes go back and modify amps that he'd already sold years earlier if he had a new idea he wanted to test on a real player in the real world. There's a great story about Jackson Browne, one of Dumble's earliest and most important patrons. Browne lived right next door to Dumble for a while, and he ended up buying nearly every new prototype that came out of the shop. Dumble would literally take Browne's amps back into the workshop, resolder new ideas into them, swap capacitors, reshape the frequency response, using Browne's actual gear as his test bed. That's how hands-on and personal the whole operation was. So let's talk about what he actually built, because there's a whole lineage of Dumble models, and most guitar players only know the headline name. It starts with the Explosion, as we talked about in 1969, and that was his first original circuit. That got reworked over the next few years into what became his signature creation, the Overdrive Special, often just called the ODS. Dumble started producing the Overdrive Special around 1972, and the story behind it is one of my favorite pieces of guitar folklore. The inspiration reportedly came from hearing Robin Ford play live through a Fender Bassman with a Tube Screamer style overdrive in front of it. Dumble heard that combination of Fender clean headroom and pushed up front end of grit and thought, I can build that into one box permanently and make it better. The Overdrive Special became a 2-channel amp, a clean channel and an overdrive channel, but the way Dumble voiced the interaction between those channels was the real trick. The overdrive side was built to sit right on top of the clean channel, essentially overdriving it rather than just being a separate distortion circuit bolted on. The result is that famously singing, harmonically rich, almost vocal quality that people describe as the Dumble sound. Long sustained touch sensitivity and dynamics, and a top end that stays smooth even when you dig in hard. From there, the family tree branches out. The Dumble Land and its more guitar-focused sibling, the Dumble Land Special, a slightly dirtier, more aggressive cousin of another legendary model called the Steel String Singer. The Steel String Singer, or SSS, is often described as Dumble's cleaner, more headroom-heavy design, built for players who wanted that huge, glassy, almost acoustic-sounding clean tone at high volume, with the overdrive character living mostly subtly underneath it. Then there's the rest of the catalog, which gets more obscure the deeper you go. The Winterland, a monstrous bass amplifier repeatedly capable of pushing up to 200 watts, built for the kind of massive PA-less stages bands were playing in the early 70s. The name is a nod to the old Winterland Ballroom in San Francisco. There was the Hotel Hog, a small 25-watt design, the Dumble Man, around 50 watts, and a modular rack unit called the Phoenix, and the Dumbulator, not really an amp at all, but a device Dumble built to let players interface his amps cleanly with onboard effects, similar in spirit to the effects loop. And because every Dumble amplifier was custom built, you'll sometimes hear about oddball one-off amps built inside actual Fender chassis, or heavily modified Fender combos that got their own nicknames. Kenny Wayne Shepherd, for instance, has talked about Dumble-modified Fender amps he calls things like the Ultra, the Sidewinder, and the AC 763. Each one a different Fender platform that passed through Dumble's hands and came out on the other side completely transformed. So when someone says a Dumble, they usually mean the Overdrive Special specifically. That's the flagship, the one you'll see fetch the biggest headlines. But the full catalog is much stranger and more varied than that. So how many did he actually build? Well, this is a number that always blows people's minds. Across his entire career, decades of work, Alexander Dumble is estimated to have built somewhere around 300 amplifiers total. Now, some sources put it closer to 350, but either way, we're talking about a total output over an entire lifetime that a mid-sized factory could produce in a week. And within that already tiny number, some models are rarer still. The Dumble Amp Special, for example, by some accounts, only about 10 of those were ever built. Individual amps get tracked by serial number in the collector world the way vintage guitars do. People will reference a specific unit as, say, Overdrive Special number 102 or Dumble Amp number 5, because at this level of scarcity, each individual amp basically has its own biography. The scarcity combined with the mythology is exactly why prices have gone into the stratosphere. It's genuinely common now for a used Overdrive Special to sell for tens of thousands of dollars, and not even shocking anymore to see one across the $100,000 mark. A 1978 Steel String Singer was listed a while back for somewhere around $125,000. These are, dollar for dollar, some of the most expensive production guitar amplifiers that have ever existed, right up there with the priciest vintage Les Pauls and Strats. Alexander Dumble passed away in January of 2022 at 77 years old, and in the way these things tend to go, his passing didn't cool off the market. If anything, it did the opposite. With no possibility of new amps ever entering circulation, the finite number that already exists became even more precious. And it created this strange parallel industry too. Companies like Two Rock, Fuchs, Amplified Nation, and Seriatone started creating Dumble-inspired amps for players who will never get anywhere near the original, chasing the tone, though, through careful reverse engineering. But of course, a big part of why the Dumble mythology runs so deep is the guest list. This isn't a niche builder's amp. This is a who's who of electric guitars across blues, rock, jazz, fusion, and beyond. Robben Ford is really the amp's patron saint. He's the guitarist Dumble was reportedly listening to live when the whole concept for the Overdrive Special clicked into place. Ford ordered his own ODS in the early 80s after renting one first, and by his own account, Dumble already knew exactly what he wanted to build for him. Because he's heard Ford playing through a stock Fender Bassman years before, and had been thinking about it ever since. Then there's Stevie Ray Vaughan, who owns several Dumbles, including Steel String Singers and a Dumble Amp Special. And that Dumble Amp is the amp reportedly used on parts of Texas Flood, one of the most influential blues rock recordings ever made. Carlos Santana ran Dumbles through his rig for years. That huge singing sustain you hear driving his lead lines is a big part of the Dumble fingerprint. Larry Carlton, one of the defining session and fusion guitarists of the 70s and 80s, owned a pair of Overdrive Specials. Eric Johnson used both the Steel String Singer and an Overdrive Special, chasing his own famously pristine violin-like tone. And most recently, John Mayer became one of the most public Dumble evangelists of his generation. He's owned an Overdrive Special, a Steel String Singer, and reportedly the very Dumble Land that once belonged to Stevie Ray Vaughan. Interestingly, Mayer apparently once asked Dumble to build him a new Dumble Land Special outright, and Dumble turned him down. Not over the music, for what's been reported, but simply a personality clash between the two of them. Even wanting one and having the money wasn't a guarantee. Joe Bonamassa has a couple of ODS units in his famously enormous amp collection. Ben Harper, Jason Isbell, Keith Urban, Sonny Landreth, Ry Cooder, and Eric Clapton. The list just keeps going. Almost every player on it has one thing in common. They're known for touch sensitivity, for dynamics, for the kind of vocal expressiveness in their playing. That tracks, because that's exactly what a Dumble is built to reward. So that's the Dumble story. A Bakersfield kid with a soldering iron who decided, against every incentive in the music business, to stay small on purpose. Roughly 300 amps, built one at a time over half a century, for a client list that reads like a Hall of Fame. No factory, no catalog, no compromise. Alexander Dumble may be gone, but between the surviving originals and the companies now building tribute amps in his honor, that sound isn't going anywhere. If you've ever heard a guitar tone that made you stop and go, "What is that?" there's a decent chance somewhere down the line the Dumble amp is part of the answer. If you've enjoyed this look at Dumble Amplifiers, make sure to share this episode with a friend. And take a minute right now to go and leave a 5-star review wherever you're listening to the show. It's incredibly helpful. Also, when you're on YouTube, subscribe to the show there and also follow me on Instagram. There's plenty of cool content to check out there as well. And remember, the best guitarist is the one having the most fun.